Anomalies. Anomalies.
Anomalies.
Hello, and welcome to another episode of Anomalies. This is a program about things seen out of the corner of one's eye, about shadows and what lurks in those shadows. This is a program about the unexplained and the unexplainable.
Welcome to another episode of Anomalies. You know, Dave, I've always been fascinated by strange places. I know you and I have talked a lot about the Skinwalker Ranch, which is in Utah, and that's a very weird, strange place. So my nephew, Alan, we were going someplace in the car the other day, and he said, what do you know about the Hockomock Swamp? And I said, I don't know a damn thing about the Hockomock Swamp. I'm not sure where it is. And he said, well, I was going to listen to a podcast about it, and so I got on the internet, the be-all and end-all for information about everything, and found out where the Hockomock Swamp was in Massachusetts, and found somebody who might be able to talk about that. So, had you heard about the Hockomock Swamp before?
No, not really. That's kind of your domain in our little arrangement here, as you go to the weird places and you find the weird creatures and the often weird people who study them. And I suppose you have to be weird to be into that, right? We're all a little off in that because we're so interested, but I didn't know any details, which is why I'm really glad that we have our guest Paul Eno here to fill us in on those details.
Well, Paul, welcome. Welcome to Anomalies.
Yes, welcome.
Well, thank you very much, fellas. It's a pleasure to be with you.
Well, it's a pleasure to have you. Now, you don't live in Massachusetts, right?
Well, almost. I live in Rhode Island. The state line is about maybe tenth of a mile up the road from me. So we're about 20, 25 miles from the what's commonly known as the Bridgewater Triangle.
Right, Bridgewater Triangle. So let's find out a little bit more about you before we get into the Bridgewater Triangle and the Hockomock Swamp, one of the strange places we're drawn to. So tell us a little bit about your background. At one point in time, you were going to be a priest. Is that correct?
Well, that was the plan, but it didn't quite work out that way. I entered this. My brother was already in the seminary. He was ordained in 1963, so he became a priest and a rather well-known theologian. Teacher as well at the university level and seminary level. I entered the seminary at the age of 14 when you could still do that. Not a good idea in the celibate environment for a young man. It's not really healthy. But I, had my eye on the goal and pursued that way. I had been interested in the paranormal since the death of my father in 1961 when I was 7. And I wanted to know, where's my father, right? And the nuns at the time, I was in a very strict Catholic school, even though there was a mixed marriage and my parents were different religions. And the nuns had said, if you eat a hot dog on Friday or commit suicide, which is a terrible thing to say, but my father took his own life. I was there, a terrible thing, defined my life in a way. You would go straight to hell. And my father was a wonderful man, health issues, but, nothing mental that I knew of. And I said, he went to hell? I mean, what kind of God is this? So Sister Mary Joel, one of the Sisters of Alleged Mercy, they were either saints or potential axe murderers, I think. Fortunately, Sister Mary Joel, my second grade teacher, was one of the saints. And she essentially got me through this by saying, well, God is kind of bigger than all that, in so many words. And I respect that really helped. I respected that. So here I am, 14 years old, entering the seminary. And, you're studying, it was really a high school. You're studying the usual subjects and plus getting some spiritual training as well. No heavy theology yet, anything like that. However, in the back of my mind was, where is my father? And I ran into the notion of purgatory. Right, which every good Catholic school child knows about. It's the idea that if you're not quite bad enough to go to hell, not quite good enough to go to heaven, you go to this purgatory place where you're purged, hence the name, and then you presumably get into heaven after that, and also satisfies the Western mania for pigeonholing everything. So the issue there was, I wondered, are these ghosts we hear about, throughout history and every culture or every time, are they souls in purgatory maybe, or was that where the doctrine came from? And we didn't study that in the seminary. Matter of fact, in my entire seminary career, we never really looked into it. However, that was in my mind. So I heard about 1970, a very strange place in Northeast Connecticut, which was an abandoned village or farm area that had a lot of strange things going on. There was a historian who was reserved judgment about the existence of ghosts, but he took a lot of very strange photos in this area since the 1940s with his little Kodak box camera. And I was intrigued by the streaks in the trees, the lights, and all different things that really shouldn't have been there, according to a photo lab. So push came to shove, and I organized 1970 through 1972 a sort of an expedition of myself and several seminarians, along with this historian. And the things that happened there were really quite remarkable and happened right off the bat. For example, you would enter this area. With our first trip was in August of 1971, and you'd go in, you'd hear the normal day in the life of somebody else. Farm implements, metal implements banging together. You'd hear cows, dogs, even a cat, people talking as if it was a normal day. And they didn't seem to show any sign whatsoever of being in purgatory, or as a matter of fact, they didn't show any sign of being dead at all. And so by the end of this case, with all the things that happened, they're incredible stuff that happened to all of us. We all witnessed it. I came to the conclusion that something is wrong here. There's something wrong with the initial ideas about what we think it's about dead people. And by the end of the 70s, I was convinced it wasn't about dead people at all. It was something far more interesting. And by the end of the 80s, I'd been looking into something. Told me at one point, investigating these cases, go on outside, take a look outside, talk to the neighbors if you can, if they don't think you're a fruitcake, and so a lot of them will tell you, when you can't talk to them, that they were having problems too on their property or in their houses. Now, I'd been through exorcisms, assisting a priest at that in the 70s. I'd been through the Bridgewater poltergeist case of 1974 with Ed and Lorraine Warren, and been injured by a flying television. So I'd seen all this stuff already, but none of it added up. The old ideas just didn't add up. And I was a really, really awful, weird questioner, even in the seminary. Like, I'd point out stuff like, well, okay, the Bible says Christ was in the tomb after his crucifixion for 3 days. Well, I said, Friday evening to Sunday morning, dawn is not 3 days. It's like a day and a half. And, that's not, and the point is that it happened, not that how long it took, but that bothered me, stuff like that. Right? I'd say to the faculty, well, I mean, you have Christ as truly God and truly man, according to the theology. Wouldn't he have had a wife and had children? And they say, oh, well, of course not. So by the end of the 70s, I should say by 1975, I was in the college level seminary, the major seminary, the first 2 years of the major seminaries they call, and then you supposedly go on to 4 years there, and you're ordained. But in my haste to find something wrong with everything, I found a lot of things wrong with the Roman Catholic Church, and I said, this really isn't all that faithful to the original. And I thought that the Eastern Orthodox, like Russian Orthodox, Greek Orthodox, was more faithful to that, and so I switched to that church at the end of my senior year. About to graduate and go on to the theology. However, that the faculty I had at Wadham's Hall Seminary, doesn't sound like a Catholic seminary, but it was very, very rather supportive of this paranormal work. I was rather surprised. The Warrens came up and gave a talk at the seminary at their own expense, and that sort of thing. And they were very tolerant of my switching to another church, that did not happen. Roman Catholic seminaries did not leave the church, right? They let me graduate, and I went on to St. Vladimir's Orthodox Theological Seminary in New York City, and they're the ones who had enough of me, all right? It was like, you're a new convert, keep your nose in your books, and they didn't like the Warrens, and so by 1977, they didn't want to hear it. Out I went. They didn't even want to talk to me. So it was there was some negotiations about coming back, but it never happened. So maybe the church and I both had a lucky escape. The odd thing with the Orthodox is most of their priests are married. So I was in a much healthier environment, but the female students and things, but anyway, it didn't work out because of the paranormal thing. So that's the story of that. And so that I ended up a journalist because the only other thing I knew how to do was write. So
and ask questions too. It sounds like that's a pretty important skill. It kind of reminds me of Socrates a little bit. One of my favorite philosophers was Socrates, and of course, we all know what happened to the questions, or what happened to him because of the questions he asked. He was essentially ordered to leave Athens, and then when he wouldn't do that, was ordered to kill himself. So, asking too many questions,
analyzing the process of dying as it was happening, rather high-minded, I think.
Yeah. Now you mentioned the Warrens. So some people listening to this podcast might not know who that is. Talk a little bit about who Ed and Lorraine Warren were.
Well, Ed and Lorraine Warren were unique. They were a couple that they really were not, formally educated in any formal sense that we would know today. They were, Ed was a World War II veteran, and they both found an interest in art, and they'd been married for some years already when I encountered them. And somehow Ed said he grew up in a haunted house, the standard bio of any ghost hunter, and he was interested in that subject. So he and Lorraine believed she was a light trance medium. And so all this kind of came together, and as well as doing art and odd jobs, they ended up professionally investigating paranormal activities when that was very unusual. Now, in those days, you had sort of the academic side. You had the Rhines, Louisa and Joseph Rhine, founders really of modern parapsychology starting in the 1930s. And you had the theological side. My mentor, Father, although Louisa Rhine was a mentor of mine too, but Father John Nicola, who was a technical advisor for the film The Exorcist, was one of my mentors. I met him through my brother in Washington, D.C. And we were... he was really great. Interestingly, he said that a lot of the weird things happening on the set that you hear about were true, but he's sorry he ever got involved with it. But in any case, there was the theological, and then there was the pop ghost hunting thing that was just starting, and that was represented by the Warrens. There was sort of a pop theological approach, that sort of thing, very conservative Roman Catholic groups they were involved with, and this sort of thing. So I first met them. And of course, in 1972 was, or just before that, was the Conjuring case. The Conjuring film came out in 2013. Right. That was supposed to be them. Okay. Now, I first met them in 1972. I'd written something about this case I just talked about in Pomfret, Connecticut, and the whole purgatory idea. And Lorraine read it, and she thought that was a fabulous idea, because they're supposed to be so Roman Catholic. So they invited me down to dinner. And not only did I meet them, I learned that Lorraine is one of the best cooks I ever encountered in my life. And at their little house in Monroe, Connecticut, at the end of a cul-de-sac. And that's how the relationship began. So I worked with them till about 1978, when my ideas really began to change about what this was. But they were still kind of into the spiritualist thing. It's about dead people. Maybe they're right. Maybe I'm wrong. I don't know. But it didn't work for me. So we became very close personally, but sometimes there were things that I just, there wasn't a lot of effort to write things down or to keep a lot of records, but we had some exciting times. There was of course, the biggest one being the Bridgeport poltergeist case of 1974. And that's, if you want to talk about that, we can, but that's was a real barn burner, that was. And, fellas, probably the worst aspect of the paranormal as far as fear is concerned is not some of the phenomena. It's the phenomena that smash your belief system. Is all we really have is our belief system. And when that's taken away from you, it really pulls the rug out. And that happened to me in the Bridgeport case. And then subsequently, as I say, later in the 70s, it was really confusing. So that's who Ed and Lorraine Warren were. And the Conjuring 2 was supposed to be about this Enfield poltergeist case in England, and I don't believe they were ever actually there, but who cares? It's a good story. So that's who they were. But as we kind of broke up about 1978, I actually questioned that on a case, and as close as we were personally, he didn't really appreciate that. And we had a peace conference at an ice cream shop we both liked. And that was the last time I saw them. And of course, not now they both translated, as Ben and I say. But I look back on many happy memories of them.
You weren't involved in their investigation of the Amityville horror, were you?
I would have been if I had not been in school in the seminary at the other end of New York State. Now, Lorraine wrote me letters during that case. And of course, it turned into a 3-ring circus, maybe more than 3. And Father Nicola told me that whole case was a hoax. Mm-hmm. And that was good enough for me. Now, I'm not saying the Warrens caused it, because there are a lot more people involved in it than the Warrens. But if Father Nicola said it, I took it to the bank. So, but I wasn't directly involved.
Uh-huh. All right. So let's talk about where, excuse me. Let's talk about where you live and what lies north of you, the Bridgewater Triangle. So how would you describe that for someone who maybe doesn't know anything about Massachusetts?
Okay, well, actually, in Rhode Island, which isn't very big, Massachusetts is both to the north and the east. Okay, so it's more to the east of us. The Bridgewater Triangle is made up of a number of recognized regions, such as the Freetown State Forest, the Hockomock Swamp, as you mentioned, and that general vicinity. And now, a word about triangles. Triangles are, at least to Ben and I, are arbitrary research tools. Okay. It's not to say that there's this line and everything stops on the other side of what would be a triangle, that sort of thing. But it's a research tool. Other people may take it more literally. We have found that areas do have a certain concentration, and I can get into why we think that is from a scientific point of view. But the Bridgewater area in Massachusetts seems to be the center of that. It's in southeastern Massachusetts, south of Boston, maybe about 30 miles south of Boston, the center. It's about 220 miles, square miles. And it might surprise people that practically within sight of Boston, there's a large wilderness area of that kind, but there is, and it's rather lovely, but it has a very sinister reputation. Ben and I study it as one of 5 or 6, what we refer to as flap areas that we study. And we've actually had to invent an entirely new vocabulary just to talk about all the goofy concepts and theories and methods that we use, because there just weren't words to describe things like the flashing nexus or overwashes or intersect points, things of that kind. But we think that the Bridgewater Triangle is one of those very well documented flap areas, which is an area of relatively large size that has paranormal phenomena of all different kinds that are not traditionally associated with one another, taking place. And we think they are associated with one another because of the processes involved. The closest approximation would be John Keel's notion of the window area.
Right,
okay?
John Keel, someone I'm familiar with.
Yeah. And when he was investigating the Mothman issue in Ohio Valley in the 1960s, he would always talk about window areas. There was UFOs, there were Bigfoot, Men in Black, or cryptids at least. And of course, the Mothman creature, if that's what it was itself, possible alien thing, everything was going on that you would associate with the broader paranormal spectrum. Same thing in the places like the Bridgewater Triangle. The Wampanoag people have rights to some of the land there. They, I noticed early on, they will come once a year and have a meeting there. Then they scatter. They don't like to be there because it's so weird. And I've talked to some of the Wampanoags, and they say it is a thin place, a place where the various I would put it, the worlds have very thin boundaries there, and a lot of stuff comes and goes. Okay, now they might put it differently, but that's essentially what it amounts to. And we're talking about the multiverse here, the quantum physics and the multiple worlds interpretation, things of that kind, which are really, I don't know, I wonder if it's a theory anymore, because it's actually being put into practice through quantum computing and a number of practical applications. So it's probably a fact, but it's a matter of how you interpret it. All right. Now, we've had on our show the likes of distinguished physicists like Fred Allen Wolf and Amit Goswami, and especially Wolf essentially says that he pretty much thinks we got it right, which is that you got the theory of relativity with all special relativity with all time being coexistent. There's no past, no future. Everything happens simultaneously. It just, we experience it through our consciousness as a past to future, because we are not at the point in our evolution we could handle anymore. And when we are, we're called schizophrenic, and they fill your pockets full of antipsychotic drugs. So, whereas in reality, people I've worked with in a pastoral setting in the psychiatric hospitals seem to be a lot saner than the people running the hospitals. In a lot of cases, not that there are that many inpatients anymore. But all that being said, that's essentially what a flap area is, and we think that the Bridgewater Triangle is a classic area. The Wampanoags reported that their ancestors seeing huge thunderbirds, giant birds, enormous snakes of the kind that don't live in Massachusetts. There are all sorts of Bigfoot sightings, and this has gone on from apparently prehistory all the way through to modern times. There was the Europeans started to see things right away, particularly phenomena in the sky, balls of fire, strange lights, things of this kind. And we'll also look at areas what the place names are. As a journalist, one of the things I did was write about historical features for whatever newspaper I was with. And I found it fascinating. The reasons roads and hills and places are named the way they are is for good reason. Bird Hill near Mansfield, Massachusetts, is one place where these thunderbirds were seen even into modern times. I talked to a police officer who in the 1970s, he was long retired, in the 1970s was in his cruiser, and a huge hairy creature picked up the back of his cruiser with him in it and dropped it. And he's bouncing around. Couldn't actually say he considered retreat the better part of valor, and off he went. But he saw this big hairy thing, and this is at night. But he saw all this hair in his rearview mirror, so that was enough of that. There are all kinds of stories about this place, from the natives all the way up. The name Bridgewater Triangle was coined, I believe, by Loren Coleman.
Loren Coleman, yeah, I think I know that.
Yeah, legendary cryptid researcher from way back. And he was fascinated by stories from this place. And of course, he investigated the Dover demon in the 1970s and this sort of thing, which was a rather interesting, if it was a cryptid. It came across more like a gray alien. The people would see it along the road at night, climbing around the stone walls or running across the road. And there was a number of people who saw that, not a lot, but enough to make it credible. And that's what drew Loren and one of his colleagues into the area. And he called it the Bridgewater Triangle after that. So Bridgewater being the town kind of in the middle. So if you want to talk about more cases, this is one of the most studied flap areas in the world. There are all kinds of books about it, documentaries. I would recommend a documentary. It's on YouTube by my friend Alexander Petikoff of Petikoff Media. And he's got a channel. There's a really, really good documentary about the Bridgewater Triangle, and with the assistance of his gazillion-dollar drone, which I have him take on cases when he comes with us. And it's really, really interesting to see that. Also, there, and I'm in that documentary. There's a new one, and it was funny. I was at one of the more bizarre critters reported in the Bridgewater Triangle are puckwudgies.
Yes, I heard that term.
Yeah, excuse me. And if you trace the word back, the etymology of it, you get into the Algonquian language group, and there's a word puckwudgeej, okay, which means little people. All right, so sort of North American leprechaun kind of thing. And we, Ben and I were on one of our crazy treks into that area in July 2010, and we had the 4-wheel drive going, and we're going up these areas and coming down, and we came to a spot at the head of the Coppercut Reservoir, the northern end. It was just very beautiful, and we decided we'd get out just to look at the scenery. And there's a wooded area and a very, very small beach, and then the reservoir. And we felt as though the whole area feels weird all the time anyway. A lot of negative stuff is going on there, murders, things of that kind, cultic stuff. And we decided to we felt like we were being watched, and we just shot photos all around us, okay? Now, I did intelligence photography in the military, and one of the things you realize is that the play of light on leaves in the woods, especially if there's a little breeze, which there wasn't this day, can lead you to all sorts of conclusions that aren't particularly correct. Pareidolia will come in. The mind will take something and interpret it, whether it's a sound or a visual stimulus, in some way that the mind can understand. Well, one of the strange things, and this is if people want to see this picture, it's on NewEnglandGhosts.com, which is in dire need of reconstruction. But if they look in the cases as the Bridgewater Triangle, they can click the link, and they're two of the pictures we got are there. They looked like little people. One is, and I know Dave Schrader, the famous radio guy, almost fell out of his chair when he saw these. Flesh tones in nature, one of the things you learn, are very rare in this latitude, unless it's some kind of fungus, okay, or mushroom or something. And that's not what this was. It looks like, in one picture, the head almost of a monk with a brown cowl type thing, but the flesh tone in the face is very clear. There's also a full-figured person in furs, looking like, with some kind of hat, and it just, I can't explain. It looked to me like there was something legitimate. Now, this is all digital photography. Back in the days when we were using ordinary, Tri-X or different films that had negatives, you could go to the lab and you could see, well, this is a reflection, or this is most likely this, and anything that was an extra, as we called it, was anomalous, then you think, well, maybe it's something, but you really can't say. But these things are they really struck us. It's very clear. Now, 5 years later, we were working on our book. Here's, I don't know, nobody can see it, but Behind the Paranormal 2, Bigfoot, Mothman, and Monsters You Never Heard of. And we had a section about our experiences in this triangle. Now, 5 years after our photographs, there was a man who was walking his dog, and the dog's name was Bingo. And all of a sudden, the man and the dog saw a little figure, so he claimed, about 2.5 feet high, dressed in the sort of drab colors. And this figure was gesturing, wanted them to go into the woods. And that's exactly what the Wampanoags spooked about. And they said, you never go, never do what these things tell you to do. What they are, who knows? So the guy thought he was kind of crazy, but then he saw that the dog saw this too and was freaking out. And of course, they didn't go with it, and they left, and they never came back there again. So this is one of many, many stories of Pukwudgies, if that's what they are, that have come down to us from modern times and ancient times. So I'm rambling on here. If you wanted to talk
No,
about
that's okay. Interesting. Dave, do you want to jump in here?
Well, I tend to take notes as as the conversation progresses, and I've got about 12 questions already that I'd like to ask Paul, but I tend to be the big picture guy here, I guess. Mm-hmm. It's all relative. And I'm always asking, what does this, yes, we can talk about 1,000 different cases of little people or fairies or elves or gnomes or Bigfoot or whatever. But, I always end up, and I can tell you're the same way, Paul, is that you want to know what is the cause of, what could cause all of this phenomena to, congregate in a specific area, call it a vortex or a thinning of the veil, or just, some intersection nexus of different factors that leads to, a place that can generate all sorts of weirdness. And so I'm wondering, and also I'm wondering about I wanted to ask you to kind of riff on the idea that because some of these areas have a concentration of such a variety of weird things, it makes it much easier, I think, from a skeptical point of view to dismiss, because, you saw Bigfoot there and a UFO and a fairy, it's just like, come on, that's too much for any skeptic to take on board. Even a real skeptic. I know most of them are pseudo skeptics. They don't intend to be objective about anything, but it's so much easier to dismiss when you've got an array of things that are seemingly disconnected. But what I hear you saying is that this might be more evidence of a real phenomenon, in that it can generate a whole array of different weird stuff, which implies that it's coming from the same source. or it's allowing humans to see a variety of things because there's that open window or there's that thinning of the veil or whatever. So can you talk a little bit about why this could be evidence for what your position is?
Sure. That's very well put, David. I agree 100% that the bigger picture needs to be looked at. Okay, a little background and factors that may contribute to what we think is going on. All right. One is the notion in quantum mechanics that these parallel worlds, however many there may be, it goes from 11 to infinite numbers, have different laws of physics. Okay. There are some experiences outlined in my last book that I hated writing. I didn't want to write about it because they're so bizarre. But you get to a certain age, you don't care what people think, right? So there's the notion that you may have intersecting worlds with different laws of physics, different inhabitants, things of this kind. I mean, why is it that I stood in a kitchen in Bridgeport, Connecticut in November of 1974, 3 police officers on one side, 3 firefighters on the other, and we watched the refrigerator float, a 300-pound thing at least, perhaps because there was an overwash, another word we invented, of a world with different physical laws in which the thing was weightless or something of that kind. I've seen very little evidence that entities actually do these things. Okay, but that's poltergeist. That's there are examples of that in the triangle as well. But as part of the larger picture, in any flap area or anywhere, period, the whole planet, as John Keel said, is haunted. Really, in a broad sense of the term, you've got all sorts of interactions between various worlds with different laws of physics. There's a notion of the world family, okay, which we all move through, perhaps millions of them in a day. The family has very similar laws of physics. It might cause you to walk into your kitchen and you put your keys down on the counter, turn around to get something, get a beer out of the fridge, and turn around, the keys are at the other end of the counter. All right. Little glitch in the fabric of space-time, within half an hour, you think nothing of it. It's one of those things, but when something starts playing Frisbee with your fine china in the dining room, that gets your notice. Okay. But I think the whole phenomenon is the overwash and intersect points of parallel realities. Now, in an area with a flap area like that, you have large numbers of intersect points. That's our theory. And the question is, why would it be there? Well, a lot of it has to do with the geotechnics of the area. We're looking into right now a phenomenon known as the Boujee Anomaly. Okay, now that's a well-known gravitational anomaly. It's well known to geologists and seismologists and engineers because they use it to look for oil and gas deposits. So it has a practical use and is important in the economy. Now, where the Boujee Anomaly is present, suppose you walk down into a river valley like the Ohio Valley, where the Mothman thing took place, you would expect gravity to get a little bit heavier because you're approaching the center of the Earth, albeit by a minuscule amount, but it is measurable. Where the Boujee Anomaly is present, just the opposite happens. You're moving down and you get a little bit lighter. And a lot of the people in the Mothman area are affected by this. There's a lot of radon in that area, for example, where the Boujee Anomaly is present. That's just what they seem to go hand in hand in some ways. And the people have become immune to the poison, a lot of them. So there's all that sort of thing. So, what does this have to do with anything? Well, what did Einstein say about gravity? It bends space and time. Now, whether there's enough in the areas of the Boujee Anomaly to create any kind of serious disturbance, that's another question. But we're just tracking it down because the Boujee Anomaly, if you look at a gravitational anomaly map, every single flap area, including Rendlesham Forest in England, has major Boujee Anomaly underneath it. The largest one in Connecticut, for example, is under the Litchfield, Goshen, Torrington area, where we've had a case that's been running for going on 16 years. That is the next best thing to the Skinwalker Ranch as far as a flap area is concerned. Boujee Anomaly, ultra present in the Bridgewater Triangle too. So if there's anything to this idea, maybe that's a reason, or one of the reasons, that the intersect points are all kind of drawn to that, and all kinds of funny things happen with space and time. So I think that I mean, in areas like that, you get ghosts, UFOs, Bigfoot, all the stuff that that the paranormal is made of, but related in the sense that the same processes are allowing it to manifest. The the whole UFO thing, if these are craft from somewhere or somewhen else, they may consciously use these phenomena to travel. Okay. One of the things I hated writing in this book was I always advise people not to be to avoid the mediumistic stuff at all costs, because you don't know what you're dealing with. And yet, when I relate some of the cases by experiences, it sounds as though I'm doing precisely that. Many of them I've encountered. The very first one, as a matter of fact, was while I was doing pastoral work with the exorcist priest I was working with at St. Lawrence State Hospital in Ogdensburg, New York, near my seminary at the time. And there was this haunted hallway, as the people thought of it. They didn't like to be there. And I, through a process of meditation and encountering someone I didn't expect, seemed to find out that this is just a parallel world experience. Not to get sidetracked here, but a woman who was a patient there, one of the physical maladies. It was a state hospital. She wasn't just a nutball. Said she was a psychic medium, and that there was a guy. The hallway felt weird because there was a guy waiting there to take his wife home. The obvious spiritualist 19th century implication being that the woman was about to die, and her ghost husband was waiting to take her home to heaven or the light or nirvana or Pittsburgh or wherever. So, yeah. So it was, as it turned out, what the person I encountered wasn't dead, was in a parallel world waiting for his wife across the river in Prescott, Ontario, at the Canadian National Railway Station, where I'd often go to Montreal, 120 miles away. But it was apparently very clearly in a parallel world, and there was a bit of a language difficulty because he spoke English, but the syllables were all wrong, the emphases were all wrong. It was, and there were some strange terms, but it was pretty clear. So and here I am in the middle of a psychiatric hospital in this little room talking to myself. If they'd ever heard me, I would have ended up a patient probably. So that was not a good scene in that regard. But there were a series of these encounters, and I think it was all having to do with the geotechnics, the presence of the water, the St. Lawrence River, a mile wide at that point, and the intersect points, parallel worlds with different laws of physics. Because this guy, Gilbert, his name was, so he said, in his world, it was very, very normal to speak with neighbors. The emphasis on the final syllable, neighbors. And presumably people in parallel realities where there was an interplay, and they didn't think it was weird at all. So if that's what it appeared to be, I went back to the seminary. I didn't come out of my room except for exams for 3 days. They sent somebody to see if I couldn't deal with this smashing of the belief system. I'd never even heard of anything like this. So I think this is an example of what we may be seeing in the Bridgewater Triangle area, of the interplay of various parallel worlds with different laws of physics and different inhabitants.
So what makes it even more complicated is clearly that some people, for whatever reason, individually are able to tune in or are more oblivious to this realm. As in my case, I think of myself that way. It's like I've never had a paranormal thing happen to me in my life. Seems like my blinders are very strong, but obviously some other people, these phenomena kind of follow them. Or we had Barry Taff on our show. He has a perspective that a lot of this is psychogenic. It's the person is causing the phenomenon for some reason, or is very interactive, proactive, whatever. So you've got also that variable, which makes it extremely hard to ever pin anything down, because one person may be super sensitive to a so-called vortex area, and while another person is just, I see nothing, I hear nothing, you're crazy. So you've got that. Can you talk a little bit about the idea that maybe humans have an innate ability to interact or sense these other worlds, these parallel worlds, but that for some reason we have been cut off from that. Maybe the sense has been disabled through lack of use or intentionally blocked, dampened. I mean, what is after looking at all these things for so many years, what do you think about that idea that humans should be able to, and some are able to interact, but a lot of us, most of us aren't with any regularity or predictability or intentionality? It's just sort of seems random for most people. Can you talk about that a little bit?
Sure, and I'm glad you brought up Barry and his ideas. I think he's really onto something there, because there's another factor that I didn't mention, and that's that I think that people participate actively in these. You don't just sit there like a lump and these things happen to you. You participate in it. Example: September 16th, 2016. I'm in a field in Pennsylvania, in the what we call the Pennsylvania Triangle, or the Du Bois Triangle. And we had gotten a lot of strange pictures of photos of strange lights in the sky on a previous trip that previous May. So I'm up there with my monster truck, and I have my cameras all set up to take pictures in the sky. And you think nearly after 50 years of doing this, Paul, don't expect what's going to happen, because it's going to be a surprise. You can't predict it. And sure enough, I look to the right, and there is a huge figure. It's a brilliant moonlit night, Friday night. And there's a huge, hairy figure. I remember the huge knees and legs moving up and down, and its head bowed as if looking for something. And my jaw drops, and I snap a picture through the closed, cold window with an infrared camera, so no signature. And I get out very carefully, and my phone rings. It's my wife, closest I ever came to divorce. So turn the phone off, Paul, but I'm in the middle of a field in the middle of the night in Pennsylvania. Who's going to call, right? So my ringtone was the theme from Lord of the Rings. That goes blasting out over the field. So naturally, whatever this was, gone, bye-bye. So the next morning, Shane Searway and I, if you haven't had Shane on the show, you should, one of our colleagues, we found a track, something, the ground was hard, it hadn't rained, but something on two legs had come up through this tall grass, and it stopped probably when my wife called, and then turned around and went back. Now, that night we had the first of what are now coming up on 5 neighborhood meetings in that vicinity. And they so many people have been coming. We had to move it to a restaurant in 2019, the last time we were able to do it. And I told this story, and a hand went up. And it was a woman named Melissa who lived in a house just on the other side of the field. She said, because I right after the experience, I'd seen a light up in a tree. And it looked very ordinary, like a flashlight. I said, maybe whatever this was. So the woman, Melissa, and her son had come back that night from the store and had heard, so they said, something big moving just above their house through that field while I was seeing it. I said, what's with the lights? And she said, well, sometimes they're in the trees. So people around here are so used to this, they went up and they were shining lights up in the trees. So if that's what it appears to be, it's, corroborative evidence, that we at least saw something big. But everybody who comes to these meetings, we've had them on camera, we've had them in interviews, and has seen Bigfoot and strange lights. And sometimes they have ghostly stuff going on in their houses. Same thing as in the Bridgewater Triangle and areas like that. So that's an example. Now, the actual example is a little girl who had a terrible experience almost in the same place. Now, when I go into these things, I try to keep it very positive. I pray, I kind of meditate a little. I'm at peace with the environment, that kind of thing. But a little girl just down on the road behind where I was had a Bigfoot experience with the same kind of creature, so she said, in broad daylight. She was coming home from school, and she was utterly terrified. She has come to 2 neighborhood meetings with her parents, and all she does is cry. And she won't talk to us. So the question arose, do you get out of this experience what you bring to it? Because if these really are multiversal creatures, as it were, and you got an area here, it's not wilderness. These things come and go, and nobody knows where. If they are coming in, going from parallel worlds, shape-shifting, as the First Nations would say, then what exactly is going on? I think when you experience these things, you are partially in their world and they are partially in ours. Partially across the membrane. A physicist would actually call it a membrane, or a brain, B-R-A-N-E, electromagnetic boundaries, as it were, according to some, between these parallel realities, and electromagnetics kind of hold everything together. So I think that may be one lengthy explanation for your brief question about how these things may interact, why, and that we bring something very special to it, and we bring different things to it. Why is it that some people have actually interviewed people will see a UFO? There'll be a large group. Some people will see it, some people will not.
Mm-hmm.
What's that? So I think there's a very, very subjective element to this, which really cannot be dismissed. And a skeptic, I attempt to approach it as an open-minded skeptic and say, well, where's the evidence? Well, what constitutes evidence? Are we dealing with something that's outside of the narrow 18th century paradigm that we use, a materialist paradigm that we use as the scientific method? Does the scientific method have to be rewritten? That would be kind of like messing with the U.S. Constitution. I mean, heaven only knows what would happen, because the scientific method brings a certain discipline of thinking that is sorely needed in this field. However, is it good enough? I don't think so, but I'm more of a philosopher and theology background than physical science. But I don't know. These are all questions that come up. So I think, there was a real element of us bringing something to this, and I think it has a lot to do with what we get out of it.
And what about the idea that humans are that particular part that allows them to bridge that connection between the worlds? If we are disabled in some way, if that part of our brain, and of course I'm kind of hinting at tinkering with our genetics or some sort of evolutionary process that has either maybe as a protection, a way to protect us from, again, as you mentioned, you might end up in a sanitarium, a mental institution, because you can see across the membrane, and you can't, it's like our brains aren't able to handle so much sensory input simultaneously. It literally will drive us insane to have to deal with that much information. So it almost appears that we've been cut off intentionally or for some other reason, to varying degrees, by individual. Of course, it varies. And what role might religion play in quotes, protecting us from that other realm? Is it all fear-based that seems to be termed of the devil in almost every case? Is it fear-based? Is it to protect us? Is it, just bias in thinking? Talk about the religious aspect of some of this paranormal stuff.
All right. Well, to take your first question first, I think that we have various survival mechanisms programmed into us, or we wouldn't have survived. People think, you have the picture of the cavemen, the dumb clucks, hitting women over the head and the clubs and all this stuff. Well, that's nonsense. I mean, if they weren't very smart, they never would have survived. All right. So I think that part of that smarts really came from what we call today psychic abilities, or even, other things, sensitivity to various worlds. Or else how would we have known if we didn't have a funny feeling that we were being watched, that, the saber-toothed cat was up on the ledge thinking about lunch, right? So as a result, I think that we were able to survive. I think that is latent in all of us and not necessarily latent. And I think that's a major part of our survival instinct. Why is it that the people who develop psychic abilities, for what that's worth, will come up with different conclusions sometimes, because they're in touch with different worlds, maybe. That's one idea. Now, as far as the religion is concerned, I've always been fascinated by the alleged idea that science and religion are at each other's throats. That has only really been the case since the sort of the evangelical fundamentalist kind of thing came up, with the lousy English translation of the Bible in the 18th and 19th centuries. Before that, science and religion were essentially, at times, almost one and the same. Mm. And I think that the paranormal is the mother of both science and religion. Had there not been questions and unexplained phenomena that our remote ancestors had to deal with, there might not have been science or religion, at least not in the forms they are today. Our ancestors were convinced they were in touch with supernatural beings. If you go to Ayers Rock or Uluru in Australia, the cave paintings will knock your socks off. You got Bigfoot, or as they call them down there, yowies. Probably what you yell when you see one. I don't know. And then there are all sorts of discs and the funny looking alien things, and people in suits, at least that's what it looks like to the modern eye. And these things are 20 and 30,000 years old. And I spent some time there with a native elder, one of the Mindalui, little guy who was a Aboriginal elder. And I was in the process of, I was waiting for extraction. It was in the line of duty. And I was near Melbourne, and he was, we had a wonderful conversation for like 7 hours. I bought him a lot of soda. And he was talking about how he didn't like Mr. Spock, but he also talked about the dream time and the entire thing with the parallel worlds and things, and the shamanic activities that they would carry on themselves. And I was very lucky because they usually don't talk to outside. But I was doing paranormal work because it was 1979, and was rather confused by what I was encountering. And he said, "You're on the right track. That's what we do. We go into parallel worlds and make real what we need." In so many words, he said that, and he used a couple of Australian localisms like up a gum tree and things. I had to learn what that meant, but a wonderful fellow. And speaking with a Cree elder in Quebec, the other end of the planet, he said the same thing. Both of them told me about people being actually brought back from the dead by medicine men or shamans or elders when they were boys themselves, when they had been kids. So that was really quite the eye opener. So I think that when religion is coming into the thing, religion is what? It's a response to our conception of God. And it also becomes very institutionalized, and clergy become, they I don't think they deliberately do it, but just over time, things become ossified and control and power and this sort of thing. But really at the bottom of it, they will tell you that the most ancient peoples, whether it be the Aboriginals in Australia or the Andaman and Nicobar Islanders in the Indian Ocean, the San and Khoisan Bushmen in Africa, you got 150,000 years of unbroken DNA and tradition, really. And they will talk about a single God. And this was only discovered by our geniuses in like the 1830s. And they were saying, this is going to be hard to believe, but it looks like monotheism preceded polytheism, monotheism being the worship of one God and polytheism, many gods. The perfect example of the Sumerians, certainly one of them outside of China, one of the most ancient civilizations that we know about, certainly in the West, they all of a sudden, they would worship, they had a sort of a triumvirate kind of God. You had like a mother God, a father God, and a child. It was usually us. And, there was often be thought of, depending where you were, the mother being the earth, the father being the sky, or variations thereon. With the Sumerians, all of a sudden, and the development of their civilization is very weird. It was like one year they were hunter-gatherers, and then a year later they were all lawyers and doctors, teachers, and all this sort of thing. And all of a sudden had like 5,000 gods and demigods. Now, in my book, Turning Home, God, Ghosts, and Human Destiny, there's a theory about how that might have happened, and it had to do with the multiverse and incursions, things of this kind. But religion essentially started, I think, with the basic notion of God, but also all these influences that we were experiencing in the human psyche, whether it be beings from other realms that we thought were supernatural beings, and maybe there were in a sense, incursions by other creatures, influenced by perhaps seeing lights in the sky, things of this kind. One thinks of the pharaoh Amenhotep IV in the 1300s BC. And he, for all intents and purposes, it seems like he had a UFO experience. And all of a sudden, he decides, well, the gods are all full of baloney, so we're going to worship one god, the sun disk. And he changed all of religion. And Tutankhamun, of all people, came back and put it all back together again. But Amenhotep IV was really, or Akhenaten, as he was known, was seems like a real crank from a spiritual point of view, but he had some kind of experience. So I think that our religions today descend from all that. One of the most popular lecture programs that Ben and I give is about religion. Okay, now there aren't a lot of people in this field with theological backgrounds, formal seminary educations. So people essentially, I think, want to know when it comes to religion, okay, I belong to this or that religious group. Is it okay for me to believe in the paranormal? And we kind of looked into that, and we break it down by who would be most amenable to believing in the paranormal, particularly aliens. So despite what Pope Francis says, who doesn't apparently know his own theology, because he's talked about how he'd love to baptize aliens, but he really couldn't do that because the Roman Catholics have the black spot theory of original sin. You have the everybody's born with this original sin, like this kind of black spot on the soul and all this stuff. And that's why you have to be baptized to redeem you from the sin of Adam. But somebody from another planet didn't have the sin of Adam. And you'd have to be a child, and they're not children of Adam and Eve, from the biblical sense. Why would they have to be baptized? The Orthodox, however, and the Muslims, of all people, they usually, throughout history, they were usually at each other's throats, but on this one thing, they seem to agree. The Orthodox could very easily baptize aliens because they have a very, very cosmic idea of God and even Christ, and they don't have the black spot theory of original sin. So, no problem. The Muslims have a tremendous tradition of scientific thinking, particularly in the Middle Ages, and they from the ones I've talked to have no problem whatsoever, especially the Sufis. Of course, the others consider them heretics anyway. That's it's a long story, but the Muslims are very amenable to the idea too. So I guess it depends on the religion, and most people really don't understand their own religions. They don't understand what they really teach. And if you look at it, the notion of the multiverse, the notion of many worlds is there in just about every religion, even Christianity. When you look at the first line of the Epistle of the Ephesians, and St. Paul is not exactly my favorite guy, even though I'm named after him. I think he got, a lot of strange things going on. But anyway, in Ephesians, he refers to through him, Christ, God created the worlds, plural. I said, well, how did that get into English? And I looked it up, and it's the Greek word cosmos, which is plural, worlds or universes or whatever. So it's there. The Hindus have a very clear idea of the notion of the multiverse, particularly the Mahabharata, the longest poem in the world, the poem of India, Song of India. It's all there. So it's whether ancient or modern, it's there. It's in the Bible. It's in the ancient documents that were contemporary with Genesis, like the Atrahasis of the Akkadian Empire, the Karsag epics of the Sumerians. It's all there. I think if you read it in the original, it helps. So I went to study Hebrew at a synagogue in Providence just so I could read the Old Testament in the original, or was it what we think of the original is? We don't know that either because the documents are here and there and everywhere, and they were changed. But anyway, it does seem to say a lot of things about this notion of the multiverse. So I think it's definitely present in religion. Now, as far as protection is concerned, my closest experience of that was with exorcisms with this Father Lawrence, who lived at my seminary but didn't teach there. He worked at the hospital, at the state hospital, and he the ritual of exorcism is very commanding. Within the ritual, there are 3 different exorcisms, and there are demands that the entity tell you its name, this sort of thing. In my whole experience, that fed the entity. I just didn't think what they thought was going on was what I thought was going on. And like here I am, 20, 21 years old, like they're going to listen to me, right? So it was like, I think what we're dealing with were multiversal parasites, creatures of nature, who filled the bill of demons. Now, in the Bridgeport house in 74, I'm in there with Ed and Lorraine Warren, and we just automatically assumed these are demons. We had a priest working with us, and in the end, I had a physical confrontation with one of these things, which shattered my belief system because it was supposed to be a spirit. Spirits don't have bodies, right? Mm. So I think that the religion not only reflects these things, it can make them worse. I think the worst people you can consult sometimes are clergy because they're not trained in this. We weren't trained in this in the seminary. I was told that in the Roman Catholic seminary in your deacon year, which is your last year before ordination of the priesthood, your 4th year of theology, somebody brings it up and you can talk. But what you do is you go to the diocesan exorcist if you're a parish priest and you run into this. This is the Roman Catholic stuff. The Orthodox have a different approach, but they they say you go to this person who is trained, at least in their narrow understanding of this, and that's who you go to. That's what Father Lawrence did in the Diocese of Ogdensburg. Now, as far as the Orthodox, I found a very different approach there. They didn't like me being involved with it, but they have exorcisms all the time for everything. Their idea is the an ounce of prevention is worth a pound of cure, right? So every time anything's blessed, baptism, any sacrament, they throw in kind of a little exorcism, right? And there's an awareness of, you stay away from this or you stay away from that. You don't let it in. And they don't have a lot of problems with these parasites. Now, if the parasites aren't demons in the classical sense, why does exorcism sometimes work? Well, because if you can do it in a positive way, and I really can't put a scientific figure on this, but these things seem to feed on whatever divides us, whatever's negative, and they seem to be repelled, or the food supply is cut off when we come together, when we are united. And I once got rid of the worst poltergeist I ever dealt with, worse than Bridgeport, by using a joke book. Not the normal procedure I would suggest, but in this particular situation, I figured I'd try it. And it worked. I've never seen or heard from again. And you got to know the background. It was really wild, but it did seem to work. So what really matters is when religion is positive, it can enforce unity, and not enforce, but encourage, and it can bring in positive thinking and even humor in a good sense, And but when it's negative, such as in the Bridgeport house, very, very negative old-time Roman Catholic spirituality, it just fed the thing. So I think religion can be a double-edged sword in this, but it does reflect, I think, the most ancient beliefs of the human race, and that can be used for good or bad.
So we've got about 20 more minutes here with Paul. So I could just hear my nephew, Alan, saying, well, why didn't you ask him more questions about the Hockomock Swamp? Because that's what I'm listening for. And I really appreciate Dave's overall perspective. But let's go back to the swamp. So have you so to speak, metaphorically or realistically, have you interviewed people who've had Bigfoot sightings in the swamp, or the giant snakes, or the Thunderbirds of you or your son? And I think it's really cool that your son is involved in this as well. Have you guys interviewed people who've had those kind of experiences in the swamp?
Well, I've interviewed Pukwudgie people. There have been people who have ghost issues in the swamp. There's a truck supposedly that drives by and then disappears on the main road, if you don't mind. And I've also talked to people who have had Bigfoot sightings, just about everything. The people who live in that area, there are people who actually live in the Freetown State Forest, and they tend to be a little nervous about this. One of the things that's most common in people we've interviewed are canine cryptids, if you will. There are a lot of coy dogs, if that's how you pronounce it, around the area, but also some very, very large dogs that have been seen, or mountain lion type creatures. Now, the mountain lion has returned to New England, and the government won't admit it because then they'd have to pay to protect them. But the people who interviewed right and left have seen these. One of the strangest ones, and they don't seem to be ordinary mountain lions either, the eastern cougar. The press called it the Mansfield Mystery Cat. This is 1992, 1993. Ben wasn't even born, though, the younger son I work with today. But I'd been in England a few years before chasing the Beast of Exmoor, which is precisely one of these Black Panther type creatures, right? And I didn't see it, but I found large hairs, and there were large footprints that were obviously of a big cat. Farmers would point out skeletons of sheep where the meat had been licked out like a cat does. Dogs don't eat that way, and things of that kind. It was a very interesting experience. So I get back here and I wrote something about it. And 2 years later, I get a call from the Massachusetts Environmental Police. And they said, somebody read what you wrote about that lion in England. We got one here in Mansfield, which goes right at the center of the triangle. So there was a very prominent critic, Chief Ed Sliney, who was a fire chief in the area. And he said, it's a bunch of nonsense. But I talked to him shortly after he had walked out his front door and seen it right across the road from his house in a field. So he changed his opinion somewhat, and we were able to recover a hair, and sent it to a veterinary lab, and it tested out to be the hair of a domestic cat, but it was like 6 inches long. That's some kitty cat. So
yeah, no kidding.
So there was that, and then that seemed to end, but it was one of a long line of sightings of big cats in that area as well. So that was I almost encountered that personally. There was I'm thinking too of the large snakes. Now, the last major giant snake sighting that I'm aware of there was in 1835, and as soon as European settlers came into the area, they were aware of what the natives were saying, and they were starting to see things themselves. One of the prominent things too are strange lights, not only in the sky but on the ground and in the air close to the ground.
Kind of like a spook light. Spook light.
Yeah. And the question is, what is a UFO? I mean, is it do people see one of these lights, in the sky or near the ground? Maybe alien or ghost. It all depends on the label we put on it. The large footprints that I found in that area, this is back in the 80s, I really looked twice at those because people would talk about seeing very strange dogs, but coyotes, which have been back in New England for quite a few years now, will interbreed with local dogs and produce these coy dogs, which can look very strange and have very big feet, So that was one possibility. So you always have to look at the more natural possibilities before you look at anything paranormal. But the lights, the puckwudgies, the Bigfoot, there were people who have seen even very large birds. But of course, that if you're looking up in the sky from the ground, it's very difficult to tell the size of something unless you have something to give it some scale. Mm-hmm. So I think this area is very well known. I think that some people have just run with it and maybe exaggerated. Other people, like the guy with the dog Bingo, I think he seemed very credible to me. And plus, we got those pictures like within 100 feet of where he was seeing his puckwudgie 5 years later, presumably. So it's interesting that none other than Charles Fort mentions this area not as the Bridgewater Triangle, but in the context of airship sightings and strange lights. In 1908, 1909, there were both, and he was recounting stories from the New York Tribune. Now, having been a journalist for 42 years, I can tell that there were, especially in those times, there was some exaggeration at times, but there were supposedly thousands of people who saw over the Mansfield and Bridgewater area an airship. And for people that don't know the background of that, there was the Wright brothers were flying in 1903. There were airships, balloons and things that had been known since the 19th century, the Montgolfier brothers and all that sort of thing. And the Germans were known to be developing airborne weaponry of that kind. But that had not really come to the fore yet. But these seemed to be very well crewed and flown craft of a very unusual kind with a lot of lights shining down on people and this sort of thing. Very, very strange. The government said they didn't know what it was. And the secrecy apparatus was already in place to some degree, but not to the degree where you could keep something like that secret. And supposedly thousands of people saw this, and Charles Fort reports that from the Mansfield and Bridgewater area. 1908, of course, also a large balls of light were seen again of the kind we just described. So the light phenomena seem to be very present there. And of course, now this is the Hockomock Swamp being a swamp. You really do have swamp gas, that's commonly, attributed, sort of used to attribute to UFO sightings. But so some of that may be a factor here. But, thousands of people seeing airships in the sky, I mean, that's not swamp gas, one would think.
Yeah,
so
this might...
go ahead.
Well, I was just going to say, this might be a chicken or the egg kind of a question, but I was thinking about, and I can't remember where I was reading about this, King Phillips War, the Wampanoags, because that is the Hockomock Swamp is essentially their territory. And it seems to me there's a legend out there, and I don't know if the natives have propagated this or this is just something that has kind of seeped up to the ground historically, of the wampum belt. And there's a question as to whether or not the fact that this wampum belt has been lost and King Phillips War was fought on territory of the Wampanoags, that somehow that contributed to all this weird paranormal stuff. And we interviewed Bill Grabowski, who was a really fun interview, who wrote about the Mothman. And so we got talking to him about, well, what's going on in Point Pleasant? And one of the explanations for the weird stuff in Point Pleasant is an Indian curse. So talk about that as far as King Philip's War is concerned, and what do you think that ties into some of the things that are going on?
Yeah, well, the Wampanoags at times will talk about a native curse. Some of them will laugh at it, but there was the King Philip's War was probably the last attempt. It was in the late 1600s. The last attempt by the First Nations to get rid of the Europeans, or at least put us in our place, right? And who can blame them? It ranged really all over southern or southeastern New England, southern New England too. There was in Rhode Island here the Great Swamp Fight, as it was called. It was actually a massacre. It was really awful. I'm sorry to say one of my own ancestors was involved in that. And then the area up by the Hockomock Swamp too. The natives were very swamp hardy. They knew how to survive well in swampy areas, and that's one of the reasons there was a lot of trouble in the Hockomock Swamp area. Yeah, I think that getting back to the notion of the multiverse, things that we do and that are done to us, especially that are very traumatic, will sort of echo through the world family. All right, and all things being simultaneous. Things that are happening right now in the 1690s will echo through our area if that, because it's occupying the same space. So, yeah, I think there's something to that from a physics point of view. But there's a lot more to it than that. The area is often considered sick, so to speak. And Ben would not like me sharing this because it was very personal to him. But we were there the same day we got those photos. Ben has the ability to talk to trees, so it seems. And there were a number of trees in the oaks at the end of this dirt road. And he meditated and did his thing. I don't really know how it works, but he said that the area was sick and that there had been some kind of huge disaster in very ancient times, talking maybe 150,000 years ago, around the times of the great bottleneck in human DNA it's often traced back to that. So whatever that was, he said the area was sick, and that was really the ultimate cause of the dishevelment in the multiverse and all the stuff happening, and negative things being attracted to it. A lot of negative things have happened, as I say, cultic, murders there, things of that kind, gangland stuff.
Isn't there stuff? It seems like I read about some stuff in the Freetown State Forest there, that there were some satanic cult activities. Yes. There were some murders there. And I don't know how that fits in with the paranormal, or just, the nasty part of human behavior.
Yeah, I don't know. It's somehow they do seem to go hand in hand at times. You can exacerbate one or the other. There was, I'm aware of one instance of cattle mutilation. In 1998, it was a cow found, and it's pretty much farm country, around there, especially then. In 1998, and a cow was found butchered in the woods of the Hockomock Swamp area, and it could have been, cattle rustling in Massachusetts, but you never know. There were really no signs of there were always signs of UFOs, but nobody could really connect the dots here that was a cattle mutilation in the classic sense. So that was. Other than that, there hasn't been too much of that sort of thing going on that I'm aware of.
I know we're coming up to the end here, unfortunately, and again, being a big picture guy, I wonder, do you, in your studies here, do you see a lot of this stuff seems overwhelming and random, but it does seem that there are some certain archetypes, for lack of a better term. You don't see like frogs or butterflies or sloths or elephants or something showing. You see forms like cats and dogs, or Bigfoot is weird. Dan's been trying to convince me for years that Bigfoot is paranormal in some way, and I've resisted. But the more we speak to guests who are familiar with it, the more I'm coming to believe that Sasquatch must be part of this whole equation. But I'm looking at, you look way back into the earliest civilizations, you see these archetypes, these panthers or jaguars, down in central Mexico, that have been worshipped. And is there something to these particular forms, do you believe, that represents something fundamental?
Well, I think you're onto something there, David. When you look at the shamanic approach, there do seem to be animal spirits, things that they did what we do, and we put labels on things that we experience that we can understand, and the reality may be far deeper. I'm thinking of the Bell Witch case in the Tennessee, 1817, 1821, and that began, at least as far as I know, because I was given access to some documents because I was supposed to be consulting on that film, The American Haunting, years ago, and supposedly the first instance was when John Bell saw a large black cat or dog with red eyes. That seems to be a theme, an archetype that's present all over the Western world. I have seen the man in the checkered shirt during ghost cases, right? The little girl with flowers in her hair. Very often these turn out to be parasites, and we're just trying to push buttons. But there do seem to be deep archetypes within us when it comes to the paranormal. And a perfect example was in the Midwest. Stop me if we're running out of time. But Linda Godfrey told me this story, Linda Godfrey being a tremendous giant among cryptid researchers. Now I'm sorry to say in ill health. But she said that she had come to there was a little local museum in a town. And they said, it's funny that people will go down to the basement here and see this ball of light. But other people will go down and they'll see a young man or something else. So again, bringing to the experience what we bring to it may result in different outcomes. So she herself saw the ball of light, but she talked to people who had also seen the young man, or people had seen both, sometimes at the same time. So again, I think the whole paradigm has a lot to do with us and what we bring to it. And I think it's the first day of school.
Still, which is
today's paranormal is tomorrow's science.
Yeah, I believe that. Well, Paul, we have really enjoyed having you on with us. I think I'll see if I can get a Bridgewater Triangle T-shirt online and start wearing that around. That was in Washington. People would go, "What are you talking about?" But anyway, I enjoyed this conversation. Do you have any kind of parting words of wisdom about investigating the paranormal, or flap areas, or John Keel, or anything that you'd like to leave us with?
Well, I think that there's far more positive about it than negative. I think that there's everything is out there in the multiverse, because all possibilities are supposed to be able to be real, concrete way. And it's, I think we're a lot more friends than we do foes, and we just need to stick together.
Sounds like wisdom, if I've ever heard it. And I think it's really cool that one of your sons, Ben, is so there must be a genetic predisposition in the Eno family to look into strange, weird things. So.
Oh, yeah. In the 1600s, we're directly descended from the guy who had the first poltergeist experiences in America, at least the first European, Nicholas Disborough in Hartford, where I was born. So, yeah, it's in there.
Yeah, so it must be genetic. Well, thank you very much for being on with us. When Dave edits this, which essentially is putting in some bumper music in the tail end and the front end of it, we'll send you a copy of this, and you can post it wherever you want to, and we'll include any stuff on our YouTube post that you sent us in your email. But thanks again for being on with us. Enjoyed you.
Well, thank you for having me. It was a great pleasure.
Sure.
Thank you, Paul. We appreciate it.